There are two big threads that underline everything that I do. The first one is deglobalization. The United States changed the way the world worked at the end of World War II. Instead of an imperial trading network that was everybody maintained their own system, we used our Navy to patrol the global oceans so that anyone could go anywhere at any time and access any commodity or market and trade with any partner. That had never happened before, but there was a catch. We did this if you allowed us to write your security policies in order to better fight the Soviets. It was a guns for butter trade. We are now 75 years on from that. Cold War ended 30 years ago, and the Americans have lost interest. And so we've been drifting into ever more strategic ambiguity ever since. And then the second big piece is depopulation. Normally, you have more teens than 20-somethings than 30-somethings than 40-somethings and on. But when the world started to globalize, people didn't have to be on the farm. They could move into town and take manufacturing or service jobs. And they did this on a global scale. And when you live on a farm, kids are free labor. But when you move into town, they are very, very expensive pieces of mobile furniture. Well, adults aren't stupid, so they had fewer kids. Everyone had fewer kids. And 75 years on, the baby bust has now been so long ago and so entrenched that most of the world's major economies are past the point of no return with their demographics. You put these two things together, and the idea that you can have a global interconnected system that has a balance between young workers and consumers and older workers and their investments, that's just gone. It's not possible anymore. And so we're heading to a fundamentally new age that breaks everything that we understand of how trade and economics and agriculture and manufacturing and transport and the rest works. Davos is always a lagging indicator. By the time they get to the point that they're chatting about it at Davos, it's already past the point of no return. And we passed that point of no return probably around 2012. And in the case of some countries, even earlier. It's just that now we're feeling the effects of it. And part of that's demographic. When you have a drop in your birth rate, it takes time to play through the system, because if your birth rate halves in 1 year, you don't have the reduction in 30-year-olds for 30 years. So most countries in the advanced world passed the point of no return in roughly the 90s, and the Chinese in the early 2000s. And we are now to the point that we are noticing that we are running out of young workers. When you run out of children, no one really pays attention because they're not part of the economy in the normal sense. But when you start having labor shortages among people in their 20s and 30s, that changes the math. And in some of the advanced world, it's now to the point that they're literally running out of 40-somethings. So Davos is noticing something finally that has been coming since the 60s. But we are now at the point that we're not just at a point of no return. That was decades ago. We're now at the point where we're feeling the real and very immediate effects of a consumption class that is just gone. It depends on where you are. Every country has their own demographic structure. Every country started the industrialization and urbanization process at a different time and moved at a different pace. Part of that is because when the Industrial Revolution first happened, it was just in one country, Britain, and then eventually it came to the United States, and eventually it went to other places. The countries that started it later were able to follow the path laid down from those who came before. So with the Brits, it started with sewing spindles. We then moved into steam power, moved into railways, and it took 7 generations for them to complete the entire process because they were the first ones doing it. The United States was a little faster. It took us only about 5. The Chinese have done it in 1. The more you compress the time frame, the greater the growth you get, because it's not just economic activity from the consumption of goods. It's building out the physical infrastructure that you need to support the new technologies. That's roads, that's skyscrapers, that's rail lines. That's steamships, that's diesel ships. When the Chinese did that in 1 generation, they got 7 generations of economic activity squished into 1. So of course they experienced breakneck, record-breaking growth. But it also means they condensed 7 generations of economic activity into 1 demographic generation. And they went from living in pre-industrial subsistence farms to high-rise condos in less than 40 years. So their birth rate went from 5 or to 7 children per woman to less than 1 in a single generation. So we're watching China now going from pre-industrial to post-industrial collapse in a single human lifetime. As for the geopolitical issue, it really depends upon where you are. If you are bordering a country that is central to your economic activity and they collapse, or that they're very aggressive and they branch out, you're going to face some very serious issues. So anyone who's dependent on Chinese trade on one side or who's in the Russian borderlands on the other has a very tough fight on their hands just to maintain their systems in their current forms. But if you're on a continent that faces no real security threats, and that continent is self-sufficient or even an exporter of food and energy, say South America, deglobalization isn't going to be nearly as rough. In fact, as competing producers of foodstuffs and energy fall offline, you might actually experience a boom. So the story is different everywhere for different reasons. Roughly from 1980 to 2015, we were in the perfect moment. The Cold War was winding down and then it was over, so the security situation of the world was great. The United States was still patrolling the oceans. We didn't have to worry about any commercial shipping getting attacked, except for a few pirates off of Malacca or East Africa. And that was a minor issue. At the same time, because different countries started their demographic decline at different points, we had a balance between countries that had a lot of folks in their 40s and 50s who were very industrious and productive, and a lot of countries that were in their 20s and 30s that had the lower cost labor but were consuming all kinds of stuff. So we had a good balance between investment and consumption and production and trade in a manner that had never existed in human history before. Our mistake wasn't living in that moment. Our mistake was thinking that that moment was permanent when it was very temporary, because the foundations of that demographically and geopolitically are now gone. We're now aging into a period where we won't have the same levels of exchange. We cannot possibly have the same levels of consumption. And production is going to get broken up. So the economies of scale of the global whole are going away. Now, there are parts of the world that are in a good geographic position to profit from this. These are the countries that did really well before the global order. I'm talking about France. I'm talking about Japan. I'm talking about Turkey. I'm talking about the United States. But if you're a country that was dependent upon that peaceful interaction and that large volumes of investment or large volumes of consumption that were somewhere else, you now have to figure out a fundamentally new way to operate. We don't have an economic theory or model for how this might work, because everything since 1500 and the start of deep water navigation in the Columbus era has been based on the concept that the population is going to increase, and so there's going to be more interaction and more interconnectivity and more consumption, just bigger and more. We're now dealing with less. We don't know how to play that game. Now, for the United States, we have a continent that is safe, where we had the best parts of it. We have the healthiest demography in the advanced world, and Mexico has the healthiest demography in the advanced developing world. This is great. We're going to have, in the worst case scenario, at least another 35 to 40 years before we are in a situation like Germany or Korea or China today. We're going to be able to watch what happens to them, and hopefully we'll pick out a few lessons. The problem is, once you've urbanized, the cost of raising kids is extreme, and the sort of benefits that you have to offer have to be huge. A couple of examples. The Russians had the worst demography in the world until the Chinese passed them by about 15 years ago. Now they're only the second worst. And they tried back in the 2000s, when Putin really realized how bad the demographic picture was going to be. They offered cash prizes basically to every woman who would have a second or a third or fourth child. And so what happened is the women would have those child, they'd get their check, and they'd drop the kid off at the orphanage. And so there are now about 1.5 million to 2 million either street children or orphans in the Russian system. A one-time payment doesn't do it. The Swedes tried something significantly more robust, where they offered increasing durations of maternity leave based on the number of kids you had. So by the time you get to your third kid, it was like 18 months of maternity leave. Well, that meant that no Swedish employer would hire a woman who was under age 35, because there's a chance that if she got pregnant 3 times, she would be out of the workforce for an excess of 4 years, and you still had to pay her. So we got the highest split in unemployment rates in the world. The scale of what you need to do is huge, and we have yet to find kind of the magic numbers. And I think it's too late. Not just because of demographics and aging and that the problem is too big, but we now have so many countries that are moving into mass retirement that the financial system isn't there anymore. You have your maximum financial impact in the last decade before you retire. Incomes are high, your expenses are low, your house is paid for, the children are gone. It's a good time to be an investor. Income stops, your tax payments stop, and your investments that are stocks and bonds get liquidated as you move into safer things. That's now happening in so many places. The governments don't have the income that's necessary to attempt a large-scale pro-natal system. In terms of really good for the first world, it's probably a tie between New Zealand, France, and the United States. All countries that have a little bit more elbow room than most countries and a tradition of being in larger geographic footprints per family. So there's still room to grow in those three. In the developing world, Argentina hands down wins that one. One of the perks of Peronism is that it subsidizes a lot of the basic expenses of life. And while this has put Argentina into all kinds of financial trouble, it does mean that their birth rate has been high sustainably for the last century. On the flip side, back in the 1990s and early 2000s, the worst was Japan because they were the country that urbanized the fastest in the early 1900s, with the Germans just barely behind them. In the last 15 years, both the Russians and the Chinese have screamed past the Japanese and the Germans. The Russians, we don't have nearly as good of data anymore. They stopped collecting demographic data about 10 years ago and just started making things up. So on paper, they have a lot of children that are probably not existing. China is by far in the worst position. We now know from Chinese data that the Chinese population probably peaked back in 2003 and that they overcounted their population in excess of 100 million people. You combine that with the one-child policy, and China is facing down demographic collapse in this decade. And by that, I mean an incapacity to play their role in manufacturing or have a modern state. We're in the final years of the Chinese state's existence. Well, there's not a lot of people left in China to listen. Chairman Xi has now instituted a cult of personality that is far tighter than anything we have anywhere else in the world, and is tighter than any cult of personality in Chinese history, including Mao. There is now a buffer between him and any information. He doesn't even have advisors that give him constant updates anymore because he's literally shot the messenger so many times that nobody wants to provide him with information. Not information that might upset him, information at all. I think the best example of that was just before the Olympics when Putin was in China. Xi met with him. It was the first world leader that Xi had met with in over 2 years. And Putin lied to his face about what was about to happen in Ukraine. And his staff didn't dare challenge Putin's words. And so Xi was apparently completely flabbergasted when the war started. And the Chinese now know that everything that they thought was true about the world is wrong. The Russians aren't as tough as they were. Their weapons don't work as well. The West is willing to stand up for countries that get invaded. Not just countries, companies, boycotts. That's something they never even thought was possible. The idea that a shareholder or a consumer could pressure a company to change their global position. They now know that taking Taiwan would be harder. They know that Taiwan would have more support. If the sanctions that were put on the Russians were put on the Chinese, that would destroy the country because Russia, despite all its faults, is an energy and food exporter. China's a massive importer of all of that stuff. So it would de-civilize within a year. So everything that she thought was true, everything that the Chinese have been preparing for the last 40 years, they've been doing it wrong. And since Xi no longer has a group of smart people that he can put into a back room with some pizza and bourbon to come up with a plan B, all Xi can do is slam his head into the wall over and over and over until something cracks. And so we're seeing failure points across the entire Chinese system now. Even if Chairman Xi was to duct tape himself to a lawn chair and jump in the pool, I don't think this could be fixed, or at least not in the amount of time that China has left. Xi has been so successful with his purges that he's removed all potential leadership and intelligence capability within 2 generations of the Chinese system. And the next generation down, people aged 30 and under, have been gutted by the one-child policy. So it's a tiny group in relative terms. Some degree of disintegration of the Chinese state is now baked in, and that's before you consider the general breakdown of their economic model. The Chinese system is based on over-financing in order to shove capital into the coffers of every individual company so that they can employ people even if there's nothing for them to do. It gives people jobs so they don't rebel. But even that is dependent upon an export strategy that no longer works. China imports the vast majority of its energy or the inputs for its food system or the inputs for its manufacturing system, and then is dependent upon the sales of those manufacturers the world over. The only way China can play in that game is if the U.S. Navy encourages it, which we have been doing since 1980. All the United States has to do if the goal is to crush the Chinese is to go home. And even if the US continues to play, the demographic situation combined with the cult of personality is more than enough to drive the system into the ground. Unless you can figure out human cloning that spits out 20-year-olds who have already been educated, I really don't see it. Beijing and Shanghai have the lowest birth rates of any urban center throughout all of human history already. Their problem is simultaneously investment in labor and imports and exports. And most of the problems they face are either past the point of no return or they're dependent upon the actions of countries they can't influence. So that's one of the reasons why we're seeing such horrific lockdowns and such horrific internal purging, is they're preparing for a world where the economy is no longer the basis of credibility for the CCP. Nationalism is. And in nationalism, you don't have to have a job. You don't even have to eat as long as you're loyal to the party. Will it work? For a while. But ultimately, when you see a breakdown on the scale that we're facing here, this is a national collapse issue, not a recession issue.